Hello and welcome to another video of this series about object-oriented programming. In this video about constructors, I want to focus your attention to names given to default constructors, and especially question the sense of the name no arguments constructor, which you hear all too often, and which to me doesn't make any sense at all. Before anything, let me start by explaining the difference between a parameter and an argument. This to pave the way for what is to follow. So let's examine this small piece of Java code. I have an add method which returns the sum of two values, and that method is called twice from the main method, once with two constants 1 and 2 and once with two variable names x and y. And here the parameters are the list of variable names which are part of a method definition. And each variable has a type and a name. So here we have two parameters, a and b, both of type int. What you pass to the method while calling it, while invoking it, are called arguments. So in the first invocation we have two arguments, 1 and 2. And in the second invocation we have two arguments, x and y. So a parameter is part of a method definition. It has a type and a name. And an argument is this value, which can be constants or the name of a variable, which is passed to the corresponding parameter when invoking a method or constructor. What I mean by corresponding parameter, so x is the first argument, so that value is passed in order to initialize parameter a. Y is the second argument, and its value is used in order to assign second parameter b. So this is the fundamental definition. And let's have a look now how it is used when naming default constructors in Java. Now there are two default constructors we're going to examine, the implicit one and in the following slide, explicit. Suppose we have this rectangle class, four properties, x, y, height and width, and a toString method which returns the state of the object in a string format. And we want to use that in a client. So clearly there is no constructor defined. Still, we will be able to create an instance of this class. Why? Because the compiler will automatically create a constructor without parameters. And this constructor is called the default constructor. Since generated by the compiler, it is an implicit default constructor. When we run the code, the output will be 0 for x and y, which is okay, but 0 for height and width, which is, according to our specifications, not really valid. Because how would you render this rectangle? It would be invisible. In my video series is a minimum of 10 for height and width. So it means that we can't really use this default constructor which is generated automatically, so the implicit default constructor, and we'll have to create a default constructor ourselves explicitly, in which we define some constants and we pass those constants minimum height to the setter set height and minimum width to the set width. The client code remains exactly the same and we are happy now with the outputs. Now here the constructor clearly is defined explicitly. Now the thing what this video is about is that very often you hear that this constructor is referred to as the no arguments constructor. And the question is, can that name be justified? I can already give you the answer. It is no. Where does this name come from? No arguments constructor. It doesn't make any sense. So where does this no argument constructor name come from? As if a constructor is only a default constructor if generated by the compiler, because here's the misconception. If it is generated by the compiler, it is called a default constructor, but if created explicitly, then very often you hear, oh, then we call it the no arguments constructor. That's very confusing. Why the name change to no argument constructor from the moment it is explicit? Is it because A, when you create an instance you pass no arguments? Or B, the constructor that is invoked doesn't contain any arguments in its definition? But didn't we just see at the beginning of this presentation that what you define in the parameter lists are parameters, not arguments? So shouldn't it be then no parameters constructor? Anyway, it's not very clear what is meant until you hear Oh, well, when the object is created, then our noArguments constructor is called. Well, then they clearly mean B. All that is very confusing, and actually, is it at all correct? I like the logic that is used in the C++ language. A default constructor is a constructor that either has no parameters, or if it has parameters, all the parameters have default values. What is meant? Well, let's have a look at the small C++ class. This time a car has a private property speed, and in the constructor it gets initialized by this parameter, which can have a default value. This is something you can do in C++. The client creates two instances, a car1 and a car2. Now with the car1, no arguments are passed. That will result in speed having this default value of 0, and when printed out, car1 gets speed, we have speed is 0. The second time, the value of 20 is explicitly passed to the constructor, speed gets a value of 20, and car.getSpeed has a value of 20. Now, the core message that this slide conveys is that the naming of the constructor being used does not depend on whether a constructor has parameters or not, but how a client can create an instance of a class. If it can be done without having to pass any arguments, as in the case of car1, then the constructor that is being called is called the default constructor. Okay, so let me repeat this. What we call a default constructor is the constructor that is being invoked when the client creates an instance of a class without passing any arguments. And so whether a constructor is defined explicitly or implicitly. In this case in C++, it is explicitly defined because we defined this parameter with a default value. Okay, so this is the default constructor. So the name default constructor is the constructor whether it has parameters or not. So what is a default constructor in Java? The bottom line is a constructor without parameters, because this concept of parameters with default values in C++ doesn't exist in Java. So it is a constructor without parameters. It is implicit if it has been generated automatically by the compiler, and that happens as long as no other constructors are defined explicitly in the class. So it is a, so to speak, system-defined constructor. It is called explicit default constructor if explicitly defined by the developer, the programmer, so user-defined. If the constructor is invoked without having to pass any arguments, then it is always a default constructor, whether automatically generated or user-defined. I hope this presentation clarifies things a little bit. Now, this is my humble opinion. Don't hesitate to leave a comment, and if someone can explain me the sense of this name, noArguments constructor, please do so. Thank you for watching this video. Bye bye.